There. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
If you need it, is the other microphone.
Yeah, so I might start wandering around and you won't hear me anymore. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be back. I think I've been involved with Ricardo and this school since its inception. In fact, I remember riding on a bus talking about it before it actually came into existence many years ago. What edition is this?
10.
10th. Oh, well, that's an important day.
And we have more than 100 students this year.
Wow, it's getting big. We'll have to move to a different location. Anyway, you are from all over the world. The subject for this week, I guess, is the various aspects of the rapidly evolving characteristics of this global economy that we all live in. I think this is a lot more fun if you sort of feel free to just talk anytime you want. You'll have perspectives from, as I say, many, many different parts of the world, and it's more fun for me too. But I'm going to try to do two things today, and we'll take a break in the middle. One is to talk about the evolving map of the global economy, or what's going on and what challenges and forces are at work. And then we'll take a break, and then I'm going to spend a little time talking about the middle income transition in China, essentially because it's so important for pretty much everybody. And it's, I mean, you can think of it as, you know, a particular case that illustrates a very large fraction of what's going on in the developing world. So that's the game plan. And as I say, if you want to say something, you don't have to ask a question, because you can say that's the silliest thing I've ever heard, or almost anything else you want to say. Let me start by telling you a little bit about what I've been doing. For the last 10 years, when I got relieved of duty in academic administration, I, for a variety of accidental reasons, got involved in growth in the developing world. And I think it's fair to say I've spent the best part of the last 10 years thinking about growth in various dimensions. And the kind of history of it was, I chaired a commission on growth and development whose members were basically political and policy leaders, mostly from developing countries. And I learned a great deal from them. And we thought carefully about growth. The mission of that commission, self-imposed I might add, was to try to figure out what we'd learned from experience and research in the sort of 15, 20 year period since the last sort of serious attempt to pull all that together. That last serious attempt was the Washington Consensus, which appeared around 1990. It was controversial, became even more controversial. It was applied fairly in a stripped down version in Latin America, didn't work very well. Was pretty much ignored in most of Asia, and that seemed to go a bit better. So it's not that there's anything crazy about the Washington Consensus, but in its stripped down version, it's too simple a way to think about the growth of the developing world. I wrote a book called The Next Convergence, which was translated into Italian as the La Convergenza Inevitabile, which isn't the same thing as next. It means inevitable. They thought that was a sexier title. But anyway, and that was about the sort of century-long process that began after World War II, in which the 85% of the world's population that lives in the developing world started to experience growth for the first time. What came before that was 200 years of divergence, which starting with the British Industrial Revolution in the late sort of 18th century. And that 200 years produced really massive differences in sort of income and wealth between this 15% that live in what we now call the developed or industrialized or advanced countries and everybody else. And now that pattern has dramatically reversed, though we didn't really see it at the time. I mean, if you'd asked people in 1960, are we starting off on a century-long process in which the vast majority of us live in the future version of a high-income country, most people would have said, oh, I don't know. I mean, I wasn't thinking about it that way. But anyway, that's what's going on, and we're kind of a little more than halfway through that process. So I wrote this book, and the rest of the history was, and got involved in trying to be helpful in China and India, and Brazil, and lots of things that have been fun and challenging, and I think rewarding in the sense that the underlying, thing that's going on is that many, many, many millions of people are experiencing lots of hardships, but have a sense of optimism because they think correctly that their children and grandchildren are going to have a set of opportunities that they and their predecessors didn't have. And so this is, while it presents enormous challenges, some of which we'll encounter today, it's basically a marvelously optimistic story. And then the crisis hit in 2008, 2009, and I sort of watched this and the commentary and decided somewhere along the way that there were problems, at least, with the understanding of the growth models that were operating in the advanced countries. Specifically, I thought, in the American case, this is a bit of an exaggeration, so forgive me, but basically the commentary that occurred in sort of 2008, 2009, running into 2010 was, to use the medical analogy, we had a heart attack, we didn't die, now we'll have a normal recovery. And that, of course, was nonsense. I mean, with a balance sheet, quote, recession of you don't recover in a normal pattern with that much balance sheet damage associated with excess leverage and the collapse of asset values. And this story is different across different advanced countries, but in the American case, I started to think, well, in addition to the deleveraging process, which we're still, it's just fairly far along by now, 5 years later, but we're still in the midst of that. There are sort of structural problems, and I and others started to talk about them, but then I decided that we were sort of waving our hands around. So one of the things I'll show you today is the result of a little bit of research on what was actually happening to the structure of the American economy, and I'll show you the Italian one too, as a way of trying to understand something I'll talk about tomorrow, which is sort of what these growth models are. Anyway, so I wrote this book both about the developing countries and then about the way in which the global economy is likely to evolve in the next 40 to 50 years. And then I went around and talked about it. I'd never done this before, because I never wrote a book that anybody could read. And so I felt like a politician. So I'm in these little bookstores, in various places. Like sort of like what politicians do when they're campaigning around the weekends, when they're being in touch with their constituents. And so, anyway, I give a little talk. These are very interesting, nice people who were curious and a little bit scared and concerned by the complexity of what was going on around me. And of course, this was the post-crisis period, so that kind of anxiety was elevated. And when I took away from that experience, other than thinking there's a lot of people who would somehow like to understand this better, was the most common question I got after I talked mainly about the developing countries, was this question that sounds silly in a way, which I put at the top here, which is, if they win, do we lose? And it came so often that I started to realize that people didn't really have a framework for sort of understanding, what was going on. And people had different versions of that. Some of them thought of it as a zero-sum game. That's clearly inaccurate. A crude description of what's going to happen in the next little while is that the global economy is going to get very large, and that's going to be associated primarily with the growth of the developing countries, including the major ones, and especially focused in Asia, where 60% of the world's population resides. Another version of it was, we're going to have an economy that keeps getting bigger, and the global economy that gets bigger and bigger. And the natural question that's increasingly asked by people is, well, can you have an economy, the global economy right now, in some version of, vaguely current dollars, is on the order of 65 or 70 trillion. just to calibrate that, Europe and America are about 14 trillion. China's 7 trillion. It's the third largest if you count Europe as one. I realize that's a question mark. And then, I'll show you some graphs later on. We're on a course where, over a predictable period of time, maybe 3 decades, we could have a global economy that's 3 times the current size. Just to sort of, when you stop thinking about growth for a moment and just to suppose it occurs somehow, and take 15% of the world's population with per capita income somewhere, if you average across the OECD countries, let's call it $25,000 to $30,000, probably a bit more than that. And then take a very large fraction of the other 85% of the people who live in the world and take their incomes up to that level. And if you just do the math, with a global population that's approaching 7 billion, you'll get to a pretty large global economy. And then there's the questions that really have to do with sustainability. I mean, the question is, is the natural resource base that we have consistent with running an economy of that size? And most people think the answer to that question is no. And then we'll come back to that. One of the things that I think you're sort of thinking about is redrawing the map of the global economy. I think about this all the time. But I wanted to say one thing about that, and that is, you don't want to go in with your frame of reference being largely static. That is, the map of the global economy, whatever it is at a point of time, is changing so fast that it's not a useful exercise to spend a lot of time drawing it. It's useful exercise to collect data and know relative magnitudes, but it's far more useful, in my view, to try to understand the forces that are at work in the global economy that are producing both growth, stagnation, employment problems, climate change, 150 different things that we sort of worry about and are navigating through. So that's kind of the way I approach this. And I think static models are useful up to a point, but you want to think of this in sort of dynamic terms. Yeah.
I just want to clarify, what do you mean by the map of the global economy? Is it a very physical map, or is it just...
Good question.
I haven't been clear about that.
It's multi-dimensional map. So, one version of it is the size and location of GDP. Another version of is the linkages. So I'll show you in a minute what the sort of network structure of the global economy looks like according to one attempt to map it in terms of trade at the IMF. You can do similar maps in terms of financial flows. There's, I guess, where the population is, where population is growing. When I teach a course on emerging economies, I ask the students to go on the internet and spend 2 or 3 hours, because it's easy to do this, and just start looking up data, all right? So that you kind of have a base level knowledge of sort of elementary things, like what are the population sizes? Is it really right to talk about China, India, and Brazil in the same breath when the population of one of them, or 2 of them, is 6 times the population, 4 to 5 to 6 times the population of the other? How systemically important is South Korea? What's its population? How big is that economy? Etc. And so, I mean, we don't want to sort of spend hours and hours and hours doing this, but it's a worthwhile exercise. It's even more worthwhile if you go in with a sense of, a few models, things that tell you what to look like. When I wrote the book, I had an agent. Actually, I was the least well-known person this person had ever dealt with. I mean, his name's Andrew Wiley, he was dealing with Philip Roth and Nobel Prize winners in literature. And I thought, what's he doing with me? But anyway, so I said, people absorb quantitative information very quickly, visually. And so I'm going to put a lot of graphs in this book, which of course is a nightmare for a publisher. And he said, no, you're not. And I said, why? And he said, because what you just said is not true of most people. Actually, most people look at graphs. I'm not talking about you now, because you have some experience with it. Most people look at graphs and get nothing out of it whatsoever. It's just got some colors on it. And I started, so I said, okay. He said, you have to describe it in words. So I said, okay, and then I started thinking about why that might be true. And I think the answer is, if you have in your head what an economist would call a model, what other people call frameworks, conceptual frameworks, things that cause you to make predictions about what you're going to see if you go look before you go and look. And if you have in your head those models, the way social scientists do, and also financial analysts and strategists in business and whatnot, lots of different kinds of people. Then when you go look, basically when you're looking, you're asking a question. Does this correspond with what I would think, before I decide to look at this? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. When the answer is yes, you think, gosh, I guess the model is sort of at least right in this dimension. If the answer is no, then you need to fix the model because it contradicts. But the point is, a graph is answering an implicit question. And if you don't have a question in your head, it's not, doesn't have anything to do with anything, just not meaningful. So what I'm going to try to do today is tell you a little bit about what I think is going on in the global economy in the first part. And again, feel free to interrupt. And I'm going to start with what I think of as major trends, and then show you some sort of data. So the story, I guess I want to tell. And now, this is not a story of the last 60 years of growth in the developing countries. If you want to read about that, I think that either the Growth Commission report or the book I wrote, at least the first part of it, would be at least a useful place to start. Better put my glasses on. Can you see that? No. Okay. No, it doesn't matter. That's all. So basically, when you get to sort of right now, or the last, say, 15 years and now, and projecting into the future, viewed from the point of view of the current advanced countries, you have two very, very powerful forces. One set of forces have to do with technology, information technology in part, and its application. And then you have globalization, which is very rapid change in both the size and the income levels and the systemic impact of developing countries. And the result of that is that the advanced countries and their governments are finding it challenging to deliver stable patterns of growth, stable, inclusive patterns of growth. And the conventional instruments and tools are unimportant. If you go back for several decades after World War II and ask, what did the world look like? The answer would have been something like, end of World War II, a bunch of fairly sensible decisions about the global economy that were essentially an attempt to avoid the mistakes that occurred after World War I. After World War I, there was a systematic attempt essentially to crush the vanquished. And it gave rise to another world war and some fairly pathological sort of political outcomes. And the people after World War II, and American policymakers were sort of in the lead because it was intact and by then the dominant economy, essentially decided that the agenda was first, war recovery in Germany, much of Europe, and Japan. The techniques were used differently. The World Bank was set up not to handle developing countries, but to manage part of the process of reconstructing things in Europe. And that was one set of decisions. The second one is that the global economy was going to be open, and so that you could sort of grow in part by accessing global markets and trading. And I think people have said, people have various versions of the history of this, but but that I think the focus probably was on the advanced countries because people weren't really understanding yet how huge an opportunity this was going to create for developing countries. And so you have a sort of an unanticipated start on a process of including everybody in the global economy with fits and starts and different starting points and all that kind of thing. But if about 25 or 30 years into that process, say 25 or 30 years ago, you still had a global economy in which the sort of important parts were all of the advanced countries, and developing countries were still relatively low income. They were certainly not very interesting markets for advanced countries. And in the advanced country group, symbolized by the G7 at the time, there's relative homogeneity. And so these countries traded with each other when they had to coordinate policy. They sort of agreed with each other. By and large, it was beneficial for the developing countries, not always. But it was sort of simple, right? And that's not where we live now, right? Now the developing countries are higher income, systemically important. If you add them together, they are right at this very moment, slightly over 50% of the global economy. And if you look into the future, the developing countries, many of which are in this middle income transition that we'll talk about later, are going to dominate in the aggregate the global economy. I mean, to skip ahead, China is now half the size of the European Union or the United States. In approximately 10 to 15 years, depending on growth rates, it will be the same size. Now, if you take the comparison with the United States, at that point, the per capita income in China right now is about $6,000 in real terms. It will be roughly $12,000 by the time the Chinese economy is the same size as the American economy, and the per capita income will be a quarter of the American per capita income because the population is roughly 4 times the size of the. So the interesting thing about China is that it is now and will increasingly be systemically important at income levels where this never happened before, right? There isn't any developing country that came before China in terms of growth accelerations that has the property that it became systemically important at income levels in the lower part of the middle income range, which is $3,000 to $12,000, which makes things challenging for China because it has to balance a kind of global agenda with its domestic development agenda. But the main message is that the world, the relatively simple world dominated by relatively similar economies, or countries with similar economies, is a world that we don't live in anymore. And so for example, in the year 2000, and that's not very long ago, the OECD non-members, which is a kind of proxy for the developing world, were 40% of the global economy. In 2010, they're 49%. In 2013, they're over 50%. You got projections in your head, but we're well into the territory of, going back to the map, you can map urbanization, a very important dimension of what we were talking about. So here's just some data on per capita income. These are a little bit exchange rate dependent because they're all normalized to US dollars. But these are advanced countries with relatively high income levels. These happen to be the G7 countries, and you can see where the world is. The world's just under $10,000 of per capita income. If you look at developing countries, in various stages, Japan is a very interesting, important country in this respect. Japan was a middle-income country coming into World War II.
Some countries, if you could explain to us which ones.
Oh, sure. Okay. This is a bit of a process. I anticipated that you could only see part of the slide. All right. Let's give it a try. This is this little thing down here. This is all of the ASEAN region, right? So this is a good chunk of Asia, sort of east and south. This is China at 6,000, right? The red one. This is Japan. This is the one I was launching into in a minute. So Japan is now an advanced economy. It was the first, or one of the first two very high growth countries in the post-war period. Does anybody know what the other one was? The first? Was Brazil. Brazil. And by high growth, I mean very high growth, over 7% a year on average. Here you have South Korea. So South Korea is now in the above $20,000 range, so it would be considered, and is it an OECD country. Here's Hong Kong, city-state, kind of. Macau, this is gambling. It's kind of ridiculous, isn't it? This is the Taiwanese economy, and so it's just right at the $20,000 mark, and here's the world again. I don't really know what to do about this because there's a lot of graphs. Let's see how many you can see. All right, let me try this. Can you see this? No. Excellent. Like that. Did you see that? Is there any way to tilt that?
Increase the size of Spence slides by moving the bar in the display bar on the left, while still maintaining the slope.
All right. Sorry? I'll just talk while we're going. Yeah, see if you can make this go up there. Can you make this thing bigger? Oh, okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
We'll make them smaller.
This thing here to the left, and so these will become smaller.
That's good. Yeah, get rid of those. Yeah, that's good.
So you should reduce the size of the main thing once again. Just move it.
Is that better?
Yeah, we can see the bottom of this now, the x-axis.
Try. No, I guess not. Okay, I'll tell you what these are. This is the Chinese economy, which I told you was half the size. It's up in the $7+ trillion range now, right now. What I put on this graph, just so you can calibrate, this is in the spirit of drawing the map. This is India, Brazil, and Russia. These are the other three bricks, right? In term Jim O'Neill at Goldman Sachs invented several years ago, and now is abandoned on the ground that they're not emerging economies anymore, they've emerged. And then I added Mexico, which has recently become a quite high growth and a systemically important country. The two really important countries in Latin America are Mexico and Brazil, are in the reverse order. In Indonesia, which was an a middle-range high-growth country and then took a huge hit in the 1997-98 crisis, both politically and economically, is now really growing quite quickly. This is a very important country in Asia. It's 200 plus, well over 200 million people. So if you add the GDPs of all of these countries other than China, you get here, right? And with China's relatively high growth, assuming it continues, basically a good chunk of the important emerging economies are about the same size as one of them, China. Now, if you project into the future, and there are question marks around this, the other country that has the potential to look like this in the developing world is India, with a population of 1.2 billion people
and a per capita income of about $1,500 now. So on the order of a quarter of China. So if India were growing, just to do the arithmetic for you, if India were growing at 7%, and it's not right now, it's had a serious growth slowdown in the last 2-3 years. But if it grows at 7%, then it will double, every decade. I think you all know the rule of 72. So in 2 decades, if it doubles twice, it will be at the Chinese level. So a first approximation, in growth rates of the 7 to 10% range, India is on the order of 15 to 20 years behind China. That's just because the growth acceleration has been slower. Chinese growth essentially went from very low in the 70s to very high right at the end of the 70s and the start of the 80s when they abandoned the central planning economy. So this is kind of what the developing world looks like in terms of big systemically important countries. There are others, Turkey, for example, but I won't try to cover them all. I think I've kind of covered most of this. So the old model, as I said, had most of the developing countries pre-middle income, which has lots of implications. It means that most of people's income in early stage developing countries goes to very basic things like food, housing, and whatnot. You don't see a lot of automobiles purchased, or appliances. You do see TVs. That tends to come early, and you do see cell phones, which is part of a revolution that's going on. And so in that world, trade is dominated by, in terms of where the market is, by the advanced economies, and in terms of supply, the developing countries start to be important. Another way to describe that is that global supply chains, this is stylizing a bit, in the old days ran from east to west, right? Things were produced in a place where there was labor and or other sources of comparative advantage and ran to the advanced countries. Now, the big growing markets are in the developing countries. So for example, China has a middle income group now numbering 230 million. The McKinsey Global Institute estimate of the size of that middle income group in 10 years from now will be 630 million. Now that may or may not happen. That's based on an optimistic estimate of continued relatively high growth in the 7+% range. But 630 million people is double the size of the American economy and larger than the entire EU combined. I mean, this is what, and when people are, at per capita incomes in the $9,000 range, then they are buying things. This is one of the things I'm trying to say is for advanced economies that lots of whom have growth problems. These are enormous market opportunities that are being created. And it's a completely different mindset. It's a completely different map of the global economy than what one is used to, at least for most of my adult life. So let me talk about major trends. I guess I better talk about these because I don't think you can see them. So the developing countries are now half the size of the global economy. The network structure of the global economy used to run dominantly through the big advanced countries, if you just drew a picture of it. And that's still important because these are still big markets in terms of purchasing power and whatnot. But it's less true. So the way I put that is that the network structure is becoming more complex. There are more big hubs in it, and it's diversifying away from being exclusively focused on the advanced economies. As an aside, for those of you who are going to do various things that are involved in the global economy, thinking about who's connected to whom, if you're trying to think about both risk or growth or something like that, is really important, right? So we're not used to doing this because we don't usually draw maps. I give the IMF a great deal of credit for starting to draw them and make them easy to access. So for example, just jumping ahead, it's pretty clear in the post-crisis period that there was a question mark. And the question mark was, with the advanced countries in varying degrees of trouble, with very low growth, now Europe in negative growth, will this impair the growth of the developing countries? And the data is, so far, or at least in the early post-crisis period, is no. That is, the developing countries return to, after an initial hit, to relatively high, almost pre-crisis growth rates, and have stayed there largely, except for self-inflicted wounds and some other things. Now, the qualification to that is the downturn in Europe is sufficiently large now that it is adversely impacting the tradable side of a number of developing countries. It's such a big hit that it's actually making a bit of a dent in the growth. But to a first approximation, the developing countries, led by the systemically important ones, appear to be partially decoupled and much, much more resilient. Now, if you had had a crisis of that magnitude 10 or 15 years ago and looked at the data, you wouldn't have seen anything like that, because all of the network structure ran through the economies that were taking the hit. So, I mean, we won't spend all day on this, but if you're thinking about it, an individual country, how and who it's connected to in the global supply chain sense, and financially, but prominently in the global supply chain sense, it is an extremely important part. And the truth is, the resilience of the developing countries in the post-crisis period is a function of really three things. One is their size, that is bigger. The second is trade among them, the intra-developing group trade, that's the network structure. And the third is the income levels, right? 20 years ago, most developing countries were pre-middle income transition. Either that or stalled in the middle income transition. And now the vast majority of developing country GDP, if not population, is somewhere in the middle income transition with kind of interesting patterns of purchasing that are relevant to kind of global markets. So that's an important trend. Tradable aggregate demand. So let me pause here. Later on, I'm going to introduce the terms tradable and non-tradable, so I might as well say what it is now. Tradable part of an economy are goods and services that in principle can trade internationally. That is, they can be produced in one country and consumed in another. That set is expanding. The non-tradable part of an economy may not stay non-tradable forever, but at any point of time, it's the stuff that has to be produced domestically. So at this point in time, the non-tradable part of an economy would include most of education, most of government, most of retail, most of construction, most of hotels, foods, and restaurants. It's huge. Most of healthcare, most of education, right? Now you can imagine a world, because you're young, in which education flows across boundaries and people listen to lectures by distinguished Chinese professors, and that's how we all learn about, computer science and stuff, but that we're not there yet. I probably won't see that. Some of you may see that coming. So I mean, the point is, don't think of the boundary as rigid, because it is changing in response to technology, but it's not changing so fast that the thing is not relevant. The reason this distinction is important is that the tradable side of an economy is the part that responds to the global economy's demand, and the non-tradable part has a completely different set of characteristics with respect to growth. Let me ask you a question, having just told you what tradable and non-tradable is. Let's take this economy, the Italian economy. what fraction of it is, its output is in the tradable side?
1/3.
Hmm?
1/3.
That's correct. And 2/3 non-tradable, and that tends to be true of advanced countries. How about early stage, no, but starting developing countries, what would you guess? Yeah, I mean, so if before the start, the tradable part's very small. When it starts to grow, that side grows very quickly because it doesn't have the constraints that the non-tradable side is. The non-tradable side is constrained by domestic demand. So the actual growth pattern in a developing country connects to the global economy, starts to grow on the non-tradable side using surplus labor and whatever comparative advantage it has. And that generates income, and the income flows across the boundary and starts to produce larger amounts of purchases of things like houses, rental, whatnot, on the non-tradable side. So you have to be very careful with growth accounting. Majority of the middle income, or the emerging economy GDP is in the middle income transition now, and we'll have more to say about this. The macro risk and growth prospects are heavily dependent on political and policy actions, or circuit breakers, which are highly uncertain. Just think around the world, right, about where the uncertainty is. In America, there's a question about whether we'll sort of blow it on the fiscal side. The American economy is recovering, but I describe the American economy as an 8-cylinder car running on 5 cylinders. The Italian economy is an 8-cylinder car running on 2 cylinders at most right now. If you take the Eurozone, if you take underinvestment in public sector, sort of public goods, assets, infrastructure, education, if you take the Chinese economy now and ask where's the major risk, the answer is, will it implement these massive structural reforms that, I mean, I don't happen to be pessimistic about this one, but massive structural reforms that facilitate the structural change in the economy to a new growth pattern. So that's a world in which, I mean, you see this very often, from an investment point of view, because you have to think about macro risk, and when it becomes high, as we know from the crisis, then everything gets highly correlated with everything else, and there's a lot of macro risk around. It kind of ebbs and flows in various places. But a very large fraction of this macro risk is associated with the presence or absence of appropriate steps in policy terms. So we're right here in Europe. Europe is the Eurozone is a flawed structure for reasons you've read about. And so what is going to happen here is going to depend on two things. One are sensible fiscal stabilization programs combined with real growth-oriented reforms in countries like Italy and Spain. Reforms that are not dissimilar to what you saw in Germany in the 2003-2006 period, and a willingness on the part of the ECB, the Eurozone core, and particularly Germany, to stabilize the banking system and the sovereign debt markets for long enough to allow these reforms to occur without a blow-up. Okay, so let me take Italy specifically. Italy has a sovereign debt to GDP ratio in excess of 120%. It's the second highest in the world. What's the highest?
Japan.
Japan. Yeah, Japan's at 230%. It's mind-boggling. That's approximately 2.5 times the Reinhardt-Rogoff safe level. So you might ask yourself, how do you get that done? So back to Italy. If you take the spreads are now relatively low. The ECB is, pretty much committed. They fluctuate a little bit. They've gone up a little bit because we're not sure whether we've got a government that's functioning at the moment. Well, at least you have a government. For 2 months, we didn't actually have one. Well, we did, but not really. And so, if you look at the fiscal side of this, and investors are not piling into the sovereign debt market, even though the yields are low, most of it's held by institutions and Italians. If something goes wrong and the ECB doesn't intervene, using its balance sheet in the same way the Federal Reserve's using it in America, buying, treasuries of various maturities, then the yields could go up to 7%. And once they get up to 7%, people get really nervous because that has, for a country with 120% debt to GDP ratio, has a very big impact on the budget. So in order to meet the Maastricht fiscal targets or some altered version of them, you have to cut an enormous amount out just to handle the interest payments, right? So that's the structure. So all of this depends, when you stand back from it, on political systems and policy choices that at one level, the national level, run to serious growth-oriented reforms, and at the collective level, providing the kind of support that allows this whole process to occur. Now, people differ a lot on whether or not that's all going to happen or not. The pessimists say something will blow up along the way, and the optimists, I tend to be an optimist on almost everything, think, actually this is going to work. It's not going to be fun. It's going to be pretty painful, but we'll probably get the job done. For what it's worth, my version of and this has to do with growth, think about growth models again. A version of the European structure is that it's flawed in the following. The Eurozone, in particular, is flawed in the following sense. And I think a lot about growth. And when you think about growth, you realize that there's a fairly large set of things that are government or public sector inputs to it. For example, laws and rules that affect the flexibility of the economy, including the labor markets. Levels of public sector investment. If you're way low or inefficient on education, infrastructure, and other things, you're going to impair. This comes directly from developing countries too. You can't grow at 7% if the government's not investing, because there's no roads, bridges, railroads, and ports, to get the stuff in and out, right? Our benchmark for developing countries was public sector investment at 5 to 7% of GDP. I don't know exactly what the right number is for advanced countries, but it's not where we are now in many countries. So that's another one. The tax law, there's a whole set of things. Now ask yourself the following question. How is the Eurozone constructed? Well, it has a common currency, and it has a common central bank. But everything else that I can think of on this fairly long list of things that have effects on long-term growth and productivity and competitiveness are decentralized. That is, countries are free, provided they don't violate the fiscal conditions, to go their own way. Now, in that environment, you might expect productivity, growth, and competitiveness to diverge over time, unless there's something else forcing the convergence. And indeed, that's what we've seen, aided and abetted by a big mistake in the financial markets, which is all sovereign debt in the Eurozone is created equal. That's clearly nonsense, so we got rid of that. And so now we're in this situation where of these divergences, well, that's okay, normally, except that two of the most important adjustment mechanisms, which are the exchange for differences in productivity and competitiveness, which are the exchange rate and inflation, are not adjustment mechanisms in the Eurozone. I don't think the debate has gotten there yet. I believe the debate is about at the point of we had too much fiscal austerity, we should have less, and that'll solve the problem. Well, it won't, okay? Removing fiscal austerity is not a complete growth strategy in a global economy. And nobody, if they thought about it, would claim that it is, but they're acting as if that's the main event. That is, they're debating whether we are being too austere in various contexts and whether we should back off. But in behind this is a sort of process of forced convergence that's going to be very painful because of the absence of adjustment mechanisms. And I think probably the situation in Europe is something like the following. This is one opinion, which is, once this situation gets stabilized in one form or another, assuming it doesn't blow up, meaning the Eurozone doesn't start to unravel, then there's a real choice. They can either have a structure that forces, convergence so that the adjustment mechanisms that are missing aren't needed. But that's more centralization than just fiscal, right? That's real, labor mobility, real, lots of things. Or you can say, well, the Europeans will want this kind of decentralization, in which case the adjustment mechanisms have to be more elaborate. There has to be a way to adjust for these divergences. We'll see. I don't know how it's going to come out. Sovereign credit risk has shifted from developing to advanced countries. I'll show you a graph in a minute. I'll stun you. Yes?
If I may
Sure.
ask a quick question. So coming from Germany, we're frequently observing that we're blamed for what's happening in the Eurozone. So it seems that the continental Europe countries are growing at the expense of the periphery in Europe. So, and Italy had a GDP to debt to GDP ratio of over 100% for more than a decade. So it was not a problem before recently. So I would be interested in your standpoint on what you think is really the problem in the Eurozone. You think that these different speeds that's going on in the Eurozone are causing the problems, and why is Germany blamed frequently for these problems?
That's a very good questions. Okay. Let me start with Italy. Italy did not have a stability problem, and it has had a high sovereign debt to GDP ratio for some time, but ever since the Eurozone came into existence, it has been very, very low growth. So it actually did have a problem that goes back well before this. If you go back before the Eurozone and the run-up to it, the Italian economy had periodic, fairly substantial devaluations of the currency and that was the adjustment mechanism, and actually worked pretty well, in terms of adjusting to these, productivity divergences that were occurring. Devaluing doesn't make you wealthy, but at least it kind of, if you get out of line, you get an adjustment that allows the economy to function. Well, it doesn't make you wealthy because, for the obvious reason, it makes everything you buy from outside more expensive. Okay? So, to take a complete aside, the Chinese understand this, and so even though they're accused sometimes of driving growth by using the exchange rate as a mechanism, that's not really what's going on. They're controlling the appreciation of the exchange rate, but they understand completely that if they sit on the appreciation too much, they'll do two things. One, they'll adversely affect their purchasing power, including energy, which has to be priced in dollars. And secondly, they'll stall the structural transformation of the economy, which in the kind of most basic microeconomic level is the growth engine. Now switch to Germany. So here, this is an interesting case. So Germany in the year 2000 appeared on the front of The Economist magazine, and the title was, "Germany is the sick man of Europe." Now my friends in Germany say, that was the bad news. The good news is Germans don't read The Economist, so they didn't notice. But Germans did know there was a problem. I mean, that Germany had reunited East and West at a one-to-one exchange rate. There were huge productivity, competitiveness, employment, and growth problems in Germany, and they were starting to be recognized. And they were related to not just the East German unification, but the labor market flexibility and so on. And then there was a very difficult process of massive reforms in the German economy in the 2003 to 2006 period under the second term of the Social Democrats under Gerhard Schroeder. These were successful. These freed up the labor markets, rebuilt the social security systems that had relied on the labor market inflexibility. You know what I'm talking about. Couldn't eliminate a plant, couldn't eliminate a job, couldn't move stuff to Eastern Europe when it made more sense to do it. Exactly that sort of thing they acquired. And they made a commitment to labor to rebuild the social security systems to make the growth and employment engines run. And it was a kind of difficult but cooperative set of choices that involved business, labor, and government. And institutionally, it may be one of people debate about this, but Germany is set up institutionally to be able to deliver on this. And another important piece, again, set up institutionally, is a really, with a long history, but an increasing focus in the unemployment part of the social security system on training and reemployment. So that's part of the story. So Germany, having gone through those reforms, finds itself at the top of the heap in terms of sort of productivity in the Eurozone. Now you have a common currency, and the German economy is, quote, benefiting from an undervalued currency, which represents, at some fundamental level, kind of averaging productivity across the whole thing. And so my version, this is a complete aside, I apologize, but I think the euro is overvalued, and I cannot for the life of me understand, why it stays up there. The euro at its current level is probably appropriate for Germany and too high for virtually everybody else at 128, 130, or wherever it is today. But maybe the monetary policies in America and now Japan may be kind of leaving it up there, because the ECB has been pretty aggressive in providing a backstop for this potential instability I described, but is less aggressive in sort of intervening directly to drive, especially longer term interest rates down. And it's inevitable in an environment like this. So, and then part of the problem is that if you go to small and medium sized businesses in Italy and ask what's the borrowing rate, 7% or more, if they can get the credit from the banking system. Whereas it's way, way below that and much more accessible in Germany. So there's all kinds of, imbalances now, and kind of, in America, growth is largely demand constrained. In fairly big chunks of Europe, it's credit constrained. It's even worse in Spain because the bank balance sheets are worse because of the collapse of the housing bubble. So it's a blizzard of complexity. But the one thing Germany could do that would make a materially positive difference in the Eurozone is essentially to get rid of the excess savings. So I think you all know that the current account surplus for any country is the excess of saving over investment, right? By definition, that's an accounting identity. So Germany is running a large surplus, and the same statement is saving more than it's investing. So if it, in a variety of ways, tried to aggressively consume more, that would be a market that not entirely but largely came into the Eurozone and would help the growth prospects of the countries that are struggling, including this one. So that's kind of where we are. Oops, how did I get that? I don't know about that. I probably leaned on it. Okay. Global supply chains. Global supply chains are, I use the term atomizing. Again, I don't want to stylize too much, but the old model was you produce a good in one country and export it to another. Now, a better model is a good is produced in multiple countries in increasingly complex supply chains, and then somehow ends up in a bunch of multiple markets. It's just much, much greater complexity enabled by largely information technology. So it's the ability with very low transaction costs to go and find precisely the niches where it's natural to do various things. So to go back to Germany, one of the things the German economy has done well on its tradable side is find fairly precisely the niches where it still has a comparative advantage, and then allow the other ones to move away. So if you go into Stuttgart, you'll find a company that is the absolute world leader in producing sensors in combustion engines. It doesn't really have a very good competitor. And it innovates all the time, and it's a medium-sized company. It's one part of the so-called German Mittelstand. And that you see that over and over and over again. And other countries are in the process of doing the same thing, It's a question of speed, all right? You've got to get there fairly quickly. And then the other stuff can go. Maybe I can tell you stories later on about how this works. So that process is having two effects. One is it's making the global economy essentially bigger, I mean the tradable part. The other one is it's systematically removing what I call indirect protection. So suppose you have in some economy a set of activities, one of the functions in a global supply chain that's highly competitive and belongs right there. And suppose there are other things that are needed to support it, and it's too costly to move those things away. Then those acquire a kind of protection competitively from being adjacent to the thing that is competitive, right? Think of it as support services for product development. Well, if you lower the cost of moving that thing away, then you take away those protections. And so one of the things that people feel is sort of, in this atomized structure, greater and greater competitive pressure in respect to everything. Now, you mean, if you go look at a global supply chain, for example, you might think you'd find the R&D in Germany or America or Northern Italy. Actually, you might find it in 5 different places, all coordinated, right? You'll find one in Asia, another one in Latin America, somewhat specialized to that particular market, and so on. So, again, we don't want to spend all morning on this, but that trend is really quite important. I've talked about the emerging company decoupling. I won't say too much about trend breaks, except to say this growth in the emerging economies has caused a lot of things that you sort of semi-take for granted to probably be in the process of reversing. So let me give an example. It comes from the McKinsey Global Institute study. So they looked at the post-war investment rates globally. Now, the post-war investment rates globally have been declining from about 26% down to the current level of 21 or 20%. Why? Because they were high in the early post-war period as part of war reconstruction. We destroyed a lot of assets in World War II. And then the advanced countries dominated and the investment rates came down. And the developing countries invest at much higher rates, 30+%, in China's case 45% of GDP, but they weren't big when you took a weighted average. But the weight gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And now they're starting to be big, and their investment rates are starting to dominate. So the McKinsey prediction is that this long-term decline in the investment rate is about to rapidly reverse. And in fact, there's some evidence that it is, and we're going to go back up to 26%. Why? Because we've got to build, hundreds and hundreds of cities of 10 million people to accommodate the urbanization part of the development process and so on. I think it's a good prediction. Part of this downward trend is that in a world, the savings picture, the other part of the scissors, investment and savings, the savings picture is much more complicated, but in a declining investment world, you're very likely to have relatively, ample savings to cover the investment that's occurring. If that's approximately true and you have a big reversal in the investment rate, then this low interest rate environment that we've had for 20 years or so may not. In a world in which there are powerful underlying forces driving up the demand for capital, for savings, and so on. Anyway, I don't want this to be particular conclusions, but I'm trying to get you to sort of think about these things at a kind of global level. Finally, I'm going to show you in a few minutes, if we have time, one of the things that technology is doing is driving routine jobs. Problem that we have. Another one, of course, is globalization. And so those two things together, I think, represent, other than kind of getting rid of the impediments to growth, one of the great challenges. You can call it employment, you can call it distribution, depending on how fast the labor markets are clearing. But it's a big, powerful trend. Okay. Now I'm just going to show you some graphs. What this is the total exports and the non-commodity exports. I threw away the, this is total exports, black line. Turn it on. Thank you. And this is non-commodity exports. You can see they're expanding as a fraction of the size of the global economy. This is partly, there's two things underlying this. One is the tradable part of the global economy is getting bigger. You know, there's a service part that's now tradable in the last 25 years that, you know, more or less wasn't there before. I mean, we had tourism and financial flows and stuff like that. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that more and more economies are actually connecting to the global economy. So this long-term trend is the result of both of those things. Here's the picture that you can't see this, but I'll leave these behind. So this is kind of an IMF version of the network structure of the global economy, more or less now, 2009. And what's interesting about this is that this is China. Now, if you went back 20 years, China was growing at a high rate, but it was a little tiny economy, right? And you wouldn't see anything like this, or if you saw it, you'd be out here and most of the flows were out, right? Not in. This is now a huge market and one of the hubs in the global economy. The other ones are the US, here, UK, France, Germany. There's no surprises. Japan, here, Korea, even though it's only 40 million, and so on. And then everything else is relatively, thus far, relatively small. Anyway, the static picture doesn't tell you anything other than, but you can take my word for it, I think, that this looks very different than it would have looked a while ago, and it will keep shifting. This is just a graph of the exports of key players in the global economy as a percent of world trade. So what you see if you look down this list, these are advanced countries, and they divide into older and newer. But to a first approximation, you can see at some point the United States economy, even though it's not by conventional measures that trade exposed because of its size. You know, exports and imports would be on the order of 15%. If you looked at a little country that's highly specialized like Sweden, you'd see a completely different number. But the black line is 1970, the green is 1990, and this is 2010. The advanced countries are becoming less significant, and the developing countries are becoming more significant. That is, you see the reverse pattern. This for the advanced countries and that for the developing countries. And here's China, somewhere. Here it is. This is Hong Kong, but this is the mainland. It doesn't even appear in 1970. That doesn't mean it didn't exist, but it wasn't very connected to the global economy for sure. And then it shows up a little bit, and now it is the largest fraction of global trade. Now, one qualification that relates to the atomization of global supply chains. Gross exports are a bad measure of trade, an increasingly bad measure as you move away from the model that one country produces and another country consumes. So if you look at the almost infinitely studied iPad, for example, what you discover is about half the value is created in the United States in terms of design, marketing, image, brand image, and so on. And then if you look at the actual product, the displays are made in Korea, Taiwan, Korea, Taiwan, and maybe Japan. Semiconductors are made in the same three countries, shipped into China. It's assembled in China. This will change. In 15 years, you'll see China producing more of these components. But at the moment, and then it's shipped all over the world with the value, the jump in value associated with the American, the parent company's design. Now, most of those exports look like they're coming out of China, right? I mean, that's just completely misleading. There is for those of you who are interested in this, there is a huge project at the OECD, the WTO, and to some extent the World Bank to restate global trade data in value-added terms. Okay, so you're not, so when an iPad comes into Mexico, it's attributed as an import by Mexico from China, that chunk of value added, the assembly, right? Semiconductors, sort of South Korea and Taiwan, say displays, etc. It doesn't matter, they're not labeled, but you see what I mean. So you get a completely different picture of the actual flows. And so, for example, this is probably, at this point, a significant overstatement because of the significance of intermediate product inflows into China. In fact, I think I have a graph on that in a minute. What this is 3 trading blocks emerging in the world. One is the North American market, which is Canada, dominantly the US and Mexico. One is the EU, and now East Asia is the other very, very large, trading block in a sense. Now there's lots of questions. We talk a bit about trade and the way the global economy is put together for a moment. The post-war period was dominated by multilateralism implemented through the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, called the GATT. That was largely a sequence of trade liberalizations, largely led by the G7 type countries, but with benefits that flowed around the world. Then the GATT transformed itself into the WTO, which has a very different governance structure, much more democratic. And the WTO's first round was the Doha round, and the Doha round is incomplete, and many people think will never be completed. That may be too pessimistic. But the Doha round was started in 2000. Now the WTO is not unimportant because it is a very effective, by most people's estimates, a very effective implementer of trade rules and arbitrator of trade disputes. So it's not an unimportant entity in the global economy, but as a negotiator of multilateral, liberalizations, it has turned out to be thus far very ineffective. And what you see now in the global economy is a blizzard of bilateral or regional trade agreements. So now we have the TPP in Asia, which China views or suspects may be an attempt to sort of haul in Asia and exclude China. And you have a in-process negotiation of a free trade agreement between the United States and Europe, which I think raises questions, in the developing world. So none of us knows how this is all going to go. The benign version of this fragmented process that we're seeing is that it's progress and that it will come back together in a relatively, homogeneous world. The other, less benign, is that we're going to break up into blocks, which I think is not, at least from an economist's point of view, is not a good thing for the global economy. But we just, at this stage, don't know. This is a picture of inter versus intra-regional connectedness of major exporters. And basically the pattern is pretty clear. You're seeing larger intra-regional flows. It's just another way of taking a snapshot. And it's, in the end, it's not a policy thing. It's largely the result of the growth of big developing country markets. So they become not only sources of supply, but markets. This is world manufacturing exports, and what you can see at the bottom here, this is textiles and light manufacturing. It's the traditional starting point for a non-resource rich country. May not be that way forever. but basically it's declining as a share of global exports, and other more sophisticated products are getting to be larger and larger shares. This is an attempt to show you, so let me take, this is China. In 1995, 15.5%, this is IMF again, 15.5% of China's gross exports were how do I say it? The gross 15.5% of gross exports represented the re-exporting of stuff. That is not just shipping in and out, but intermediate products. Import content of exports. In 2005, it's 27.4 and rising, right? So what this is the atomization of the global supply chain. So, and look at the number of places it comes from. Never mind what they are, just the colors. Similar, Japan, most things came out of Japan straight out. Now they're coming from all over the place. And the reason's clear. I mean, you know, you can do it. The technology makes it feasible without high transaction costs. And more countries are entering the global economy and competing for their niches in these rapidly evolving global supply chains. Even the USA, which tends to be relatively self-contained, is experiencing this, and this is Germany. So Germany was always high, in part because it's embedded in the European structure, but now it's up at almost 30%. Yes?
How much do you think tax laws of different countries have a part to play in how this has changed?
It's a good question. I think tax laws have more to do with legal structures and where companies are, you know, formally, legally located and report profits. It's not that tax laws are irrelevant to the actual locations, but the tax laws tend to be relatively similar across a broad range of countries and relatively favorable to exports. So lots of countries have a value-added tax of one form or another that isn't applied to exports. One of the problems in the American economy is we don't have a value-added tax, so we can't forgive it. And we do have an income tax. In fact, in America, we have a tax system that's really out of line with the rest of the world in this term. So I think for the most part, I would have to say taxes are very influential and a highly controversial subject with respect to the reporting of profits and paying taxes at that level. And there are tax havens. And in fact, they're going to, right now in Ireland, in a bankrupt hotel, a G8, leaders are meeting, and it is alleged one of the subjects they're going to talk about is tax havens. And because it's become highly controversial. So, I mean, you know the story. So if you Google, you know, is located in Britain and pays no taxes, and Amazon pays very little. And I think it's worse than that, actually. If you look at flows of services in these global supply chains, it's very difficult to know where the thing was produced, right? It's almost impossible to know how you'd go about taxing that. So at some level, we have a problem. At a deep level, we have a conceptually hard problem. Yeah, back to you.
Recently, it was revealed that even though Apple is the largest taxpayer in the United States, it paid about $8 billion in taxes. It evaded more than $8 billion in taxes. And I'm forced to think how moving all these different parts of this supply chain to different countries, how that has helped Apple to do that. Not that it's done anything illegal.
That's right. No, that's exactly right. They move the parts largely to minimize costs, basically. And then they move the legal entities around to minimize taxes. And as I say, the American tax law is, you know, dysfunctional and creates incentives. So there's more detail than you ever wanted. But the American tax law says an American multinational can make a lot of money you know, from sales offshore, provided it leaves the money offshore and it's not taxed. And then when it comes back to the bank account in New York, it's taxed. Well, lo and behold, it doesn't come back. Not only that, the growing markets are out there. So these are all kind of the growing pains of a global economy that are connected like this. We're going to see more of them. Let me skip ahead before we stop. This is this is a picture of the growth of various Latin American countries. Not growth; these are the investment rates. Brazil is a country that's growing reasonably well, though it's had a growth slowdown recently. And its main problem right now is the investment rate is 18 to 19%, of which there's a fairly big deficiency on the public sector investment side. And so most people, including me, would say this has to get up to over 25% to restore, you know, growth in the 5, 6, 7% range. Now, there's a reason for this. This is a picture, this comes from a friend of mine who's a member of the Growth Commission. This is a picture of the growth in incomes across the income spectrum. So this is the lowest 10%, and this is the next 10%. And you can see the pattern here. These rates are really quite high. This is over 5%, and they decline steadily. By the time you get to the top group, you're under 1.5% in real terms over a 10-year period, 1999 to 2009. It was just before 1999 that Brazil sort of got back on track after a lost quarter century of essentially no growth. They got inflation, hyperinflation under control. This started under President Cardoso and continued under President Lula da Silva, and now under the current President Dilma. But what this is inclusiveness, right? The high growth, this is an economy with a Gini coefficient close to 0.6. That's among the highest in the world. It's to the point where Brazil had a dual economy. And basically there was an advanced economy and a very poor economy, sort of not connected to the modern economy. The symbol of this is favelas. These, you know, slums up on the sides of hills. This is what terrifies the Chinese policymakers. And what's happening is that those huge divergences in that dual economy are starting to come down. So the Gini coefficient is still pretty high in Brazil, but it's moving fairly rapidly in the right direction for the right reasons. So people with very poor educations are starting to get, you know, really quite good educations. They will have opportunities in this economy. So the main message from this is the growth rate doesn't tell you everything that's going on. Because the growth rate comes from taking an average of these things. In fact, a weighted average, right? And these people are still fairly poor. They don't get a very big weight, right? So the growth rate will tell you it's not doing that well. If you look underneath the hood, so to speak, they're solving the principal problem of equity that was built into the structure of the economy. Now, I talked about resilience and partial decoupling. This is a picture of, this is the graph I thought I would never see. Okay, so up here, down here, are the developing countries in various categories. So this is G20 emerging, black. This is emerging in general, and this is low income, the green. These are all, even the low income, are coming down, and they're sort of bottoming out and trending at 40% debt to GDP, sovereign debt to GDP ratios. These are the advanced countries, all of them, the whole OECD, and the G20 advanced, just the advanced countries. And we're trending up to 100%. Now, we may not get there, because there's a lot of pushing and shoving going on having to do with fiscal things, but this is the reason, this is This is worth staring at. Not just, because one needs to understand it, but if you start asking, why did this happen? Why did the richest countries in the world run up the highest sovereign debt levels to the point that they started impairing their growth? And why, just before the crisis, had these countries managed to get down here? Well, I'm sure you all know the answer. Go ahead.
I think in the case of Latin America is that we learn from our mistakes. We have a similar crisis during the 80s and 90s, so we learn by the wrong ways to be disciplined with our debt in the case of Latin America.
Yeah, good, very good observation. Multiple crises, much learning, and huge amounts of improvement in macroeconomic management across the board, pretty much, in the developing countries. There's various versions of this: monetary policy, inflation under control, on a slight lag from the developed countries. But the main lessons were in multiple dimensions. Excess debt is a very, very dangerous thing. Sovereign debt in the banking system, household debt when the system collapses causes a collapse in domestic aggregate demand. That's the main problem in the United States in the post-crisis period. And the most dangerous thing of all is borrowing in a foreign currency with an overvalued exchange rate. This is called the original sin now in international sort of monetary economics. Why? Because if you borrow, whoever's doing the borrowing in a foreign currency with an overvalued exchange rate, when the exchange rate resets downward, the liability resets upward by the same amount, okay? So if your exchange rate goes down, to 50% the level, your liabilities go up to double. It's amazing how often this occurs. So in the crisis, we discovered that Eastern European countries, people, individuals, households, were borrowing in euros and Swiss francs for mortgages. And a number of those countries experienced significant devaluations because they're not in the Eurozone. And all of a sudden, there's a crisis in the system. So anyway, that is a very important part of the story, and a particularly important set of events was the 97-98 crisis that started in Asia and spread all over the place. That was, I guess nobody's really sure why it started, but there were imbalances in these economies, excess debts in various places, but there was a set of approaches to exchange rate management that were misguided, and particularly at overvalued exchange rates. So in Korea, for example, it didn't start in Korea, but Korea had an exchange rate that was too high, and they were propping it up. I'm going to tell this story because this is an important part of the multiple countries sort of stories. They were propping it up essentially by buying their own currency. They had foreign reserves. They sold the American treasuries and bought their own assets, so that produced demand for the Korean currency, and then they ran out of reserves. When Stan Fisher got to the central bank in Korea at the start of the crisis and said, "Could I see the reserves?" there weren't any. And then the currency went running down and the liabilities went running up and so on. One of the lessons the developing countries learned, other than keep the debt levels down, is control your currency and accumulate reserves. Now, the IMF and the World Bank said, don't do this. You let your exchange rate be determined by markets, and don't start buying and selling assets out there. And essentially, everybody ignored them. And basically, the reason is, the argument for not doing it is flawed in multiple dimensions, but one is that it's inefficient to insure yourself by accumulating reserves. I'll explain in a minute how you do this. But in the 97-98 crisis, The IMF was supposed to be there to help with the balance of payments problems, but they weren't. Or they demanded such onerous conditions. The IMF is not welcome in Indonesia, even to this day. It takes a long time to live this down, even though the IMF doesn't behave like this anymore. And the reason is the IMF went to Indonesia, which had a huge version of this kind of crisis, and basically said, we'll help out if you do the following things. And it turned out there were 235 of them. And so they wrote this all down in a document. It was about this thick. This was on TV. And then a representative of the IMF went to sign the document along with the president of Indonesia. And the IMF representative said, do you want to read the document before we sign it? And the president said, if I read it and don't like it, will we change anything? And the IMF representative said, no. And the president said, then I don't have to read it, do I? Well, that kind of high-handed stuff is sort of largely, fortunately, a thing of the past, but it's left a residual. And one of the important residuals that's left is that virtually all countries started accumulating reserves for two purposes. And this is an important judgmental part of the growth strategy. One is insurance, protection against volatility, the ability to control your exchange rate, which is what comes with reserves. The second one is to control the rate of appreciation of your currency. So how do you do this? Well, you take inbound flows of foreign currencies, let's call them dollars for the moment. They flow through the system and end up in the central bank. Now, the central bank can do one of two things with them, right? What they do, in fact, is they take these dollars and they go buy assets, typically treasury securities, or if it's if a euro, they'll buy a German bond, 10-year bond or something like that. And they just hold them, okay? And those are their reserves. Then if the currency comes under pressure in the downward sense and they don't want them, then they'll sell those and bring the money back. And that produces demand for their currency and offsets that pressure. In the crisis, this was fairly important in multiple countries. This is maybe more detailed than you ever wanted, but if you go look at the exchange rates in 2008, basically most developing countries' exchange rates started to plunge relative to the dollar and the euro. Why? Because the foreign capital in these markets was rushing back toward the home market because of damaged balance sheets. It was heading for New York and London and so on. And so there was this tremendous outflow, and countries reacted to it differently. Part of the reaction was to just let the exchange rate go down because it made the country more competitive and a bit more resilient on the real economy side. In China's case, that because the tendency is for flows to come in all the time, over and over and over again. We never know because we don't exactly have the data, but it looks like for the first time there was an actual net outflow. So what happened in China is that they basically reversed that flow and stabilized. So if you look at the Chinese currency up to 2005, from the late 90s to 2005, it was pegged to the dollar. And then they decided that was getting too low, so they started appreciating, but with huge reserves. Does anybody know what the Chinese reserves are now? In dollars? 3.5 trillion. Half the size of the economy. It's amazing. Anyway, so then it went up and up and up, and in the summer of 2008, it went flat again. Why did it go flat? Because they started essentially accumulating reserves. And because everybody else was going down, they were losing competitiveness. So they said, we're not going down with them because that's too much, but we're not going up either. So they instead went flat. And that lasted for about 2 years now. It's appreciating again. So that's, if you look at the Chinese exchange rate, it's basically a story of appreciation, controlled appreciation, modulated by a crisis, sort of in the middle. Whoops. Okay. Let's see. We're going to take a break in a minute. think you're almost where I went. Oh, this may interest you. This is a picture of the aggregate. I'm not sure it's perfectly accurate, so don't over-process. But this is a picture of the aggregate debt in a number of countries. So this is part of the global economy that we live with. So the top two are Japan and the United Kingdom. In these bars, black is government, sovereign. Red is corporate, non-financial. Gray is household, very important element of debt. And green is financial institutions, debt. I mean, and there's important differences. So if you take Japan, it's more or less like the United Kingdom, but the big difference is the UK has, I don't know, 60% sovereign debt, and Japan has 200 and some odd. Right, so the compositions just are completely different. Take Italy. It's the second highest in sovereign debt behind Japan, but household debt in Italy is extremely low. That's because Italians save a lot and they don't buy houses with big mortgages and stuff like that. And in fact, the average household is relatively wealthy in Italy. So Italy in the aggregate ends up looking like a bunch of other countries, but still has the sovereign debt problem. And then you get down here, you have China at 150. It's rising and has some people concerned, and then developing countries way down at the bottom. I'll skip over that for now. This, I think I'll hold off until after the break, okay? So let me conclude by sort of trying to summarize what I've been trying to tell you, which is something like this. If you want to understand, kind of have a feel for what's going on in the global economy, you need to focus on sort of major trends and events. And lots of things are interesting and important. I hope I've given you a couple of them, but the main event is the growth of the size of the global economy, and this amounts to the same thing, and the tremendous growth coming from the developing countries. And China's obviously in the lead on that, but it's not by itself. And so we have structural adjustment problems in multiple economies. Some of them we shouldn't have had, some of them are an inevitable consequence of this pattern of globalization and the particular stage we've reached. I am going to show you after the break what some of the advanced country issues look like, and maybe we can sort of talk about them, because they're turning out to be fairly difficult for us, even though we compounded the problem, or maybe hid it with a defective growth model for a fairly extended period, multiple versions of a defective growth model. So I'll conclude by, just setting that up by saying, one of the things I learned, well, first of all, when we were doing the Growth Commission work, one of my fellow commissioners said, this is all about what should happen and all that. Why don't we say what shouldn't happen? And so that was the origin. He said we should have a section called Really Bad Ideas. So we all put our heads together with various kinds of experience, and we produced our top 20, not 10. A nighttime TV show. Our top 20 bad ideas. In a page and a half or 2 pages. They were things like subsidizing energy, which is a catastrophic policy from almost every point of view you can think of, etc. So we did that, and then we put out this report. It was relatively concise. It was maybe 75, 80 pages long, and then a whole lot of graphics at the end if you were kind of the sort of person who thought those things were interesting. Well, it turned out this was a smash hit. I started getting emails from all over the world. When somebody would write and say, I really like the section on bad ideas. And the reason I really liked it is I checked, and our government's doing 17 of them. And so on. slightly more seriously, I think one of the most powerful ways of understanding, effective growth models and patterns is to understand the defective ones. And it turns out that human beings and institutions have been quite inventive in this area of producing defective growth models. So if you're interested, I'm not going to try to cover them all, but this is a list of them. So in the developing world, there are many, many. One is just cutting yourself off from the global economy. A standalone economy with a per capita income of $500 may eventually grow, but it'll be painfully slow. If you look at the growth rates of developed countries going way back in time, using Angus Madison's data, the growth rates were very, very low up till the British Industrial Revolution. And then they jumped to an astonishing 1.5% in real terms. I mean, that's considered almost nothing in the post-war kind of, developing world. But England didn't have anybody, there wasn't any global economy to leverage, to take advantage of. And then continental Europe and the United States grew at about 2.5%. But you won't see anything like 7 to 10% until you get to the post-war period. By this time, two things had happened. One, from a developing country point of view, you had a huge, almost infinite market in the advanced economies if you could find something you could compete in, right? If you know any economics, you know that means the demand curve isn't downward sloping from your point of view. You can grow and grow and grow, and you're still not big enough to have any material effect on prices, on the terms of trade, until you become as big as China. China clearly affects global prices in everything, but that's after 33 years or 35 years of extended, very, very high growth, 9 to 10%, and a population that is 1.3 billion. So that's not going to get reproduced anytime soon. And the second thing that is part of the driving this growth model is the inbound transfer of technology. Cut yourself off from those two. And this is a more general lesson, for sure in developing countries, but almost any country, because you never know where the technology or know-how or the latest innovation is going to come from. It could come from Sicily, it could come from southern China, it could come from anywhere. If you're cut off from it, you'll have a problem. Another version of it is in the import substitution model. This is an attempt to make sure the jobs are created at home, so you basically block imports, right? Say we'll do that ourselves. But what you're doing when you do that is fighting comparative advantage. You're preventing somebody who has a comparative advantage from coming into your market in order to generate, that's the wrong way to generate employment, even though the employment engine objective is a legitimate one. And an import substitution model works for a while and eventually starts to fail. And it starts to fail because you become increasingly inefficient relative to countries that are operating based on their natural evolving comparative advantage. There's an advanced country model version of that, which is basically, which I know, I grew up in Canada. Canada, Australia, New Zealand all had models that had high and rising effective rates of protection so that their economies were more diversified, cars, appliances, TVs, and whatnot, than they would be, if they didn't have those kinds of protection. So when you're undiversified, like Sweden, then you're pretty vulnerable to ebbing and flowing in the global economy because basically pretty much most of what you produce on the tradable side goes out and most of what you consume comes in because you're specialized, right? And Canada and Australia and New Zealand fought that. So even though Canada sits right beside the American economy, it had a pretty full, diversified economy that was a kind of mini version of the American one, and you just got very inefficient. In the Australian case, they had an automobile industry, and the effective rate of protection required to sustain that industry was 85% when they gave it up. That is, it cost almost twice as much to produce a car in Australia as it did in the places that they might have been importing them from. And so they finally said that's just too high a price to pay for Australian consumers. And all of these countries have now gravitated away from that model. Some of these models, just produce stagnation. Some of them produce dangerously sort of interesting sounding growth paths that blow up. So I characterize the recent defective growth paths that a number of advanced countries are on, America, a number of European countries, as the leveraged excess consumption, excess domestic aggregate demand model. And the reason those ones blow up is because the way you get there is with debt, and you're borrowing from future income in order to do it. And usually you produce an asset bubble somewhere on the way through, and that asset bubble collapses at the same time, causing balance sheet damage. And then the domestic aggregate demand, whether it's government retrenching or households retrenching, falls off. As soon as households retrench and consumption drops, investment drops, private investment drops with it because you've got excess capacity. Okay? And then you go through a process of deleveraging, but the last piece of that model, is the one we'll talk about in our last hour, is that, remember, an economy evolves structurally in response to signals from the demand side. So it isn't just the total that matters, it's what actually gets built inside the economy. And if you have excess aggregate demand on the domestic side, then you'll have an economy that's biased towards supplying that and probably biased against and uncompetitive on the tradable side. So you have an underdeveloped growth engine on that side. And if you actually look at a relatively flexible economy like the American one after the crisis, not immediately, because these things don't happen immediately, but fast enough to notice, with high unemployment and relatively flat hotel accommodations, I'm just kidding, and relatively flat wages and incomes, the tradable side started to become more effective. And then the shale gas revolution kicked in, adding to that, and you can see the tradable side start to grow. It's generating exports, it's generating employment, and it's the initial focus of the restarted growth. So the American economy is running at about 2% now. It's well below potential, and it's well below where it needs to be if you're going to go back on the trend line. I think most people think there's a huge question mark of wherever we're going back on the trend line. But that's the kind of, and what that is an adjustment that would have occurred over a much longer period of time if you hadn't had the leverage growth model running into, for probably a decade, running into the, now there's stories about why we had that, but basically, that's the idea. You want to take a quick break, and then I'll tell you a bit about, I'll show you some data on structure, and then we'll talk a bit about the Chinese economy. Yes, sir.